Here we have a Next.js application that's using Next.js 13 and React 18.2. You'll also notice inside of here that we have GraphQL code generator installed with the client preset plugin. We also have a custom script for running the code gen and running our backend. This will run a backend locally so we can interface with it from our Next.js application, and it will create APIs to create, read, update, and delete, as well as link entities from this simple GraphQL SDL. Now, because this is a Next.js 13 app, we won't be using the pages directory, so we can get rid of that, and instead we'll create a new page inside of the app directory called page.tsx. Here we'll create a new page and we'll export a simple h1 tag. So we can use the new app directory. Instead of the next config, we'll need to add an experimental flag that we want to use the new app directory. So we'll set this to true. Now that's set, let's head back to our terminal, and inside of one window, we'll run our backend. Then, instead of another, we'll run our application. We can see here in the terminal that Next13 has updated our TS config, but our server is running and ready to go. So let's head on over to localhost 3000, and here we can see the h1 hello GraphQL that we wrote inside of the new app directory. If we head to our localhost 4000 port, here we can run a mutation for our backend to create a new post. We'll give our post a title, a slug, and we'll give it some content. Then from the response, we'll grab the post ID and slug. If we execute this mutation, we can see here that locally this new post has been saved for us and we're able to access it over the GraphQL API. If you haven't used the graph-based backend before, we can see here inside of the documentation that it generates all of these different queries, mutations, input types, and it uses custom directives to handle things like validation. Now let's head back to our code. We'll leave the server running for Next.js, and we'll leave the GraphQL code generator and GraphBase watching for new changes. Now you'll notice that we have this file layout.tsx inside of our app directory. This was created automatically for us when we ran the Next server. It's inside of this global layout that we'll make a query to get all of our posts, and we'll include a link to all of our other posts. Then inside of our children, we'll render the posts page. So when you click on a link from the root, it will load into the children here all of the contents. To get started, let's install GraphQL request and GraphQL. GraphQL request takes care of some of the formatting of our requests. It's not necessary and you can just use plain old fetch, but we'll use this because it abstracts some things for us so we don't have to repeat ourselves throughout this tutorial. Instead of our root directory, let's create the folder lib, and inside of here we'll create the file GraphQL client. Here we'll import GraphQL client from GraphQL request, and we'll export a new const called GraphQL client, and we'll invoke that GraphQL client class. Here we'll need to pass it the URL for our API, and here we'll pass a environment variable. And if we open up our .env file, we can see here that we've set here the GraphBase API URL. We don't need an API key when working locally, but if you were to deploy this to GraphBase and to the web, you'll need an API key. So instead of GraphQL client, let's add our API as a string, and then we'll add for good measure the headers for our API key. And the header key will be XAPI key, and then the value will be our GraphBase API key. So this will work when you deploy, and it will also work locally. Because we're using the new GraphQL client preset plugin with GraphQL code generator, we have this folder .gql in the root of our project. From the GraphQL file here, we are going to import GraphQL. Right now there's no strings in here, but as we begin to type our GraphQL queries, they will automatically be transformed into type document nodes, and they'll be available inside of this function. So let's see what this looks like. Let's import GraphQL from GQL, and we'll import the GraphQL client from our GraphQL client folder. Now inside of here, we'll create the variable getAllPosts document, and we'll invoke GraphQL as a function. Inside of here, we'll pass a new GraphQL query. Let's give our query a name, getAllPosts, and we'll in fact use a GraphQL variable as well, so we can see what it looks like to have the fully typed variables instead of our GraphQL client. So here we'll specify that the argument first is of the type int, then we'll use the query post collection, passing in the first value from our variables. Then for each of the edges, we'll grab the node, and we'll grab the ID, title, and slug. Now, because we have GraphQL code generator running and watching for changes to files, if we head back to the GQL file, we should now see that here we have a new document instead of our object. And because GraphQL code generator is watching for file changes, and it's inspecting anything inside of our app directory that looks like a GraphQL query, it's able to automatically create a new type document node from the string that we passed to the GraphQL function. Now for our root layout, if we update this function to be async, then inside of here, we make a request to call and await GraphQL client request. Then we pass in our type document node, which is get all posts. Then for the second argument, here we can see that the variables must match this exact object. And here we can see that we have the value first of the type number. And this is because the GraphQL code generator automatically generated all the types that we need and using generics passed this to the GraphQL client. So here we'll fetch the first 10 posts. Then from the response, we'll destructure post collection. And we can see here when we hover this that we can see all about the type and what this looks like. Then further on down, instead of our body, we'll create a new tag for nav. And then for each of our edges in our post collection, we'll map through those and we'll grab the edge. Now, if the edge contains a node, we want to render a new list item. Otherwise, we'll just return null. So we'll need to add a key. And here we'll call edge.node.id. And inside of our list item, we'll invoke the link component from Next.js. And we'll pass it the path /posts/edge_node.slug. Then instead of the link, we no longer need to provide the a tags, but now we can just invoke edge.node.title. And for good measure, let's wrap this inside of an unordered list. What we want to do when we click one of these links is render the contents inside of main. Now previously with Next.js, this would require a full page reload. But with the new Next 13 updates, we can render the contents of here without having to re-execute all of this code here by using React Server components. Now if we head back to the browser and we refresh our page, we should see here that we have our default page, Hello GraphQL, and then at the top we have this Hello Next 13, and this is coming from our API. And by default, all of the content here is static. Now similar to Next.js before, we can create a new file inside of our app directory, inside of the folder posts. But instead of using square brackets to define the file name, here we'll define slug as a folder name, and inside of here we'll create the file page.tsx. You can also create its own layout, so the post slug page can contain a layout, and then you can nest other pages inside of that. We'll begin by importing GraphQL and GraphQL client, then we'll declare a new const and we'll call this getPostBySlugDocument, and here we'll invoke that GraphQL function as we did before. So here we'll specify query as our operation, and then we'll declare the operation name getPostBySlug. And we'll use GraphQL variables here, and instead we'll use a string. And this string type and non-nullable must match what is in your GraphQL schema. Here we'll call the query post to get a single entry, and using the argument by, we can provide an object here where we pass the slug from our variable. And from that, we'll grab the ID, title, and slug. Now if we go back to our gql.ts file, we should be able to see now that we have this getPostBySlug automatically generated for us. Now let's create a new page const that is async, and it's inside of here that we can call out to our API. So let's destructure post from our request, and we'll await GraphQL client.request. Then we'll pass in the getPostByDocument, and here we can see slug is available for our variables. But you're probably wondering at this point where slug actually comes from. And if you've used Next.js before, well, you can get it from the context of the current page. And just like before, you can fetch it from params. Let's type our params here so we can specify slug is a string. And then for slug, we can call params.slug. Then we'll check to see if there's a post. If there is no post, we'll simply return 404. Otherwise, we will return a pre-tag here and we'll render the JSON that's returned from our GraphQL API. Now, all that's left to do is export default that page component that we've just created. Now, if we go back to our application and we click one of our posts, Hello Next.js 13, this will then render the contents of that page inside of the layout, which contains our links from our database. What you see here is then static, and similar to Next.js before, we've got the option to revalidate. And we can now do this by exporting a new const called revalidate, where it will revalidate once that time has passed. So this has been a brief introduction into Next.js server components. We make a request to our local GraphQL backend that we can also deploy to the web. Next.js 13 and the app directory is very experimental, so I'd recommend that you check out the documentation to make sure that the ways taught in this video are applied to future versions of Next.js.